All right, so welcome to our first session in the online advanced topics in postcolonialism class, English 6460. This is going to be our introductory session, so I'm going to talk you through the syllabus. I'm going to talk you through some of the regular assignments, the sorts of things I want you to do week to week. And then we're going to discuss some of the key course concepts, right? I'll be posting these videos once a week. I'm a little late getting this one up, but for the most part, they will start appearing on Mondays. So you can expect to see, for example, my lecture on Amrita Pratam's Pinjar. You can expect that to show up, oh, what the hell, on Monday. So first, let's talk about the syllabus. Let's talk a little bit about what's set up here in Georgia View. For each of the texts, I will be posting a bibliography that will show you what sources I consulted for the lecture in each of these little folders. So when it comes time to do research of your own on these texts, you will have some sources to fall back on, and it's also just sort of in the interest of transparency, so you know that I'm not just talking out of my ass on these things. That what I'm telling you is in fact sourced. Right, so let's start in the syllabus and assignments folder. I will talk you through first the syllabus itself. It's generally a good idea, because of the way the Georgia View reader works, to just download the syllabus and look at it in Word, click View, and go to Edit Documents, and then you'll see it the way you're sort of supposed to see it. I'll tell you a little bit about how to get in touch with me, a little bit about what to do from week to week in the course. This is just sort of an interesting little side note. These flags here mark the largest migrant populations in each borough of London, like which immigrant population has the largest population in each of London's boroughs. You see the Thames River going through here. And oh, hello. No, I don't want the shortcut tools, but thank you. I forgot that this does funny things. This is a smart board, and it does funny things if you touch it. So just a little bit about how to contact me. Since this is an online class, I expect most of you probably won't be coming to campus to see me at any point. But if you need to, my office is English Building, room 239. Right? We don't have a room in which we meet. My regular office hours, this I actually need to go in and edit because my schedule has been changed. Mondays and Wednesdays I'll actually be in the office from 12 to 2. Tuesdays and Thursdays I'll be in the office from 11 to 1:30. The best way to contact me is through my GSW email account. I do not respond to Georgia View email. I don't check the email in Georgia View. I don't really like their email interface. So if you need to get in touch with me, just email me directly. Okay? Okay. So we continue on. Now, there are a number of required texts for this course. To make sure that you are buying the right edition, I would suggest checking the ISBN numbers I gave you against what you purchase. Most of these will be available through the university bookstore. A couple will not. For example, let's see, which ones are we not? Right, we cannot get Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners or Bessie Head's A Question of Power, despite the fact that The Lonely Londoners is one of the most important depictions of the life of West Indian migrants in England in the mid-20th century, and A Question of Power is probably one of the great South African novels. Those are out of print in the United States. You can get them in the UK, you can get them in Canada, you can get them in the West Indies, you can get them in Anglophone Africa, but you cannot get them in the United States. Why? I don't know. This irritates the crap out of me. You should be able to find cheap editions on Amazon, though. I got a copy of The Lonely Londoners for about $1.75 on Amazon, right? The shipping cost more than the actual book did. So see if you can get copies of these. We're not looking at either of these for a couple of weeks yet, so see if you can get copies on your own. If you can't, then let me know. All right, as far as your grade is concerned, there will be a midterm exam. This will be purely an essay test, and a final exam. This will be an essay test and will also include some IDs, and you'll have to log into whatever our test security whatnot is for that. The midterm is going to be worth 10 points out of 100. The final exam will be worth 25 points out of 100. You'll be writing 2 major papers. Paper 1 will be worth 15 points and will be a 2,000 to 2,500 word long close reading of one of the texts from the first half of the semester. The second will be a researched argument, 3,750 to 4,500 words long. You will need to use at least 5 outside scholarly sources, right? This is a graduate level class, so I'm guessing that won't be a problem. But if you need any help navigating our library and its resources, then please do get in touch with me. I'll talk more about both of these assignments as we get closer to the due dates. You will also be doing weekly response papers. Those will be worth a total of 10 points. You will need to do 10, each 500 to 750 words long over the course of the semester. If you do more than 10, it will increase your participation grade, and you can also use those to replace previous response papers you might have done poorly on. So if you get a bad grade on one, you can do another to get a better grade, so long as you do at least 10. Participation. This is an online class, right? We don't meet face-to-face. We don't actually talk to each other. So participation will be primarily through an online discussion board. Now, I have posted directions for response papers and for posting to the discussion board. I'll go over those when we're done talking about the syllabus. Now, relevant classroom policies. First off, if you have any particular disability that would qualify you for special accommodations of any sort, you don't contact me about this directly. You're going to contact Student Support Services. Their webpage is listed on the syllabus, as is their phone number. You will tell them what you've been diagnosed with, what accommodations you need, and you'll provide documentation, right, of your particular disability. They will send me a form that tells me which accommodations I need to give you. I will sign it and return it to them. You never have to tell me what your disability is because it's frankly none of my business. All I will know is what accommodations you require. So if you require any kinds of special accommodations, it is a good idea to get this out of the way quickly. Now, the University Writing Center. You may be concerned about whether you can use this or not because 1, this is a graduate level class, and 2, you're not on campus, right? You're online. The Writing Center actually does have online hours. So you can work with a tutor whenever you need to, from wherever you need to. All the Writing Center information is here, and they do work with graduate students as well as undergrads. So do feel free to use this resource. Finally, academic dishonesty. This is a graduate level class, so this is a no mercy kind of situation here. Here's how I define academic dishonesty. Any work that you turn in that is taken from a source that you do not cite, that's academic dishonesty. Any work that you did for another class that you attempt to recycle in this class, that's academic dishonesty. Any work that you didn't do that someone else did that you try to represent as your own. So say, for example, you buy a paper from someone. That's academic dishonesty. In any of these three cases, if I find that this is what's happened, you will automatically fail the class and you will be reported to the student conduct officer. Right? No appeals, no mercy here, right? If you are caught in a situation like this 3 times, right, it's a 3 strikes you're out policy for the university, right? 3 incidents of academic dishonesty and you are immediately suspended. So do not do this. Do not let this happen. All right, finally, just to explain the course calendar here, right? Week to week, I have here listed what you are expected to have read by the end of the week. Assignments are in the second column, right? So for this week, you're just supposed to watch this video. You don't have to read anything. For next week, you are to make sure you have watched this lecture and you are to have read all of Pinjar. For next week, right, we're talking about Pinjar. You're expected to have read it by next week. By the end of the week, you need to have a discussion board post and a response paper up. And you need to start reading the Satanic verses, right? So we'll be talking about the first half of the Satanic verses the following week, and so on and so forth. If you have any questions about how this works or what you're supposed to do, please, please, please come and talk to me. In the third column here, I have important university dates, right? So the last day to add this class, if for whatever reason you have not yet added it, if you're watching this video, I'm pretty sure you've added it already though, is tomorrow, the 17th. If you need to drop this class, have it not appear on your record at all, it'll be like you were never here. The last day to do that is the 21st. And so yeah, all important university calendar dates will appear in this third column. All right, so that's the syllabus. Email me if you have any questions about it or problems with it. Now, about assignments. First, let's talk a little bit about participation, since this is going to be 10% of your grade. Right, participation is going to occur solely on discussion forums. They're already set up. You'll be expected to post twice each week. Right, a week is from Friday to Friday, right? So for this week, I just want you to do one post to indicate that, hey, you're here, you're taking the class, so I can do registration confirmation. From here on, each post must follow the following rules, right? Your first post needs to be an original comment on the text for that week, right? Your own original thought about it, your own sort of brief analysis. The other has to be a response to another student's comment. Each post should be substantive. Right? It should be relatively lengthy and should address some important issue in the text. More on how to do that in a moment. Each post must be at least 250 words long. Posts that raise interesting issues or present original ideas in an engaging way will earn more points than posts that merely prove that you did the reading. So don't just go through the motions. Make sure your posts are good. Make sure they're thoughtful. Make sure they reflect what you see as some major theme or issue in the text. All right, so here are a few tips for making your posts meet the standard. First, you want to raise some interesting question about the text and try to answer it, right? What does this scene with the so-called skeleton in Pinjar mean, right? How does it depict community relations between Muslims and Hindus, right? How does Jasmine represent community relations between Hindus and Sikhs, so on and so forth, right? Some important thematic issue in the text. You also are going to want to focus on small, specific details that you think either raise new questions or help you answer other questions. Always make sure that you back up what you say with some evidence taken from the text. Right? You don't necessarily have to include the quote in your comment, but you might want to refer to a page number, say, so that people can go back and see what it is you're talking about. I also want you to analyze, not summarize, right? I read the book too. I don't need a rundown of what happened. What I want you to try to do is think your way through some important symbol, theme, or idea. Now, when you are responding to someone else's comments, don't just say, I agree. Either try to build on the idea that the other student proposed, or provide an alternative reading in a polite fashion, right? There is no reason to get angry or upset with other people. We can all be nice, right? We can all be polite. We can all get along. And of course, any questions you have about this, direct to me at michael.moyer@gsw.edu, right? You can contact me there. Now, also, the response papers in brief. Because this is the thing you're going to have to start doing more or less right away. So, you're going to have to do 10 of these. You don't have to do one every week if you don't want to. Doing more of them will increase your participation grade, as will doing more comments than you have to. Right? So if you want a good participation grade, post more than the minimum. If you post more than 10 response papers, choose one with a low grade that you want to replace and just upload to the same folder in the Dropbox. So you're going to select a single short quotation from one of the texts you're reading for that particular week. You're going to write that down. It doesn't count towards your 500 to 750 words, by the way. And provide a short analysis of some major theme, symbol, or idea in the text that you think your chosen quote is a good example of. So here's what you're going to want to do with this. First, while I do want you to explain the meaning of particular details in the quote you choose, right, do a good, solid, close reading of it, what I'm more interested in is how it relates to some bigger idea in the text, right? How is it representative of some bigger pattern or theme? You're going to want to choose short quotations as well. No shorter than a single sentence, but no longer than a brief paragraph. If you want to compare your quote to other quotes in the text to demonstrate a pattern, that's fine. That is a thing that is actually a good idea, right? Please do that. You're going to want to look overall for meaningful patterns of repetition and emphasis, but remember that not all repetition is meaningful, right? Just the fact that something appears more than once doesn't necessarily mean that it's important. So make sure you can argue for the importance of the particular pattern that you think you've recognized. Finally, it is a good idea also to look for meaningful patterns in the whole course. Right, so if you are looking at your quote and you think it relates to some theme that is run through the entire course, that's great. Please write on that. That will really, really help you both answer exam questions and work on the final paper. And once again, any questions about this, you can direct to me over email. All right, so that's the syllabus, that's the assignments. I want to talk to you a little bit now about exactly what we're going to be studying in this class. So give you some of the basic vocabulary, give you a little bit of background on post-colonial theory, and on the theme of this course, which is diaspora and migration. Right? All of the texts we're looking at feature characters who are in some sense migrant. Now, migration and diaspora are not quite the same thing. We'll get to that by the end of this short lecture. But first, let's talk about what we mean when we discuss postcolonialism. Right now, postcolonialism is a bit of a disputed term. Not everybody agrees on what it is supposed to mean. Is a post-colonial society only one which the colonizers have recently left? Is a nation or a people or a place post-colonial from the moment colonizers arrive? Right? Hence, everything is then after colonization. Right? These are some of the basic questions that animate the discipline here. And I hope that we can get to a clearer sense of how post-colonial theory works by the time we get through this. So yeah, does the post-colonial moment, the moment when the colonizer first arrives, or is it the moment when the colonizer leaves? Now, one of the sort of definitive books in post-colonial theory is The Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. They're a trio of Australian academics. And this is what the cover looks like. According to these three, post-colonial refers to all culture affected by the imperial process. Right? They're taking a very broad definition of what post-colonial means. From the moment of colonization to the present, right? Whether the colonizers are gone or not. So for Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, the post-colonial moment occurs when the colonizers first arrive, and it never ends after that, right? Any society that has been colonized is always then post-colonial. Describes the nation and culture during and after imperial domination. They also posit three stages of post-colonial literary development, right? So while post-colonialism as a condition remains, the way it's expressed culturally evolves and changes, depending on which stage of colonization we're in. First comes a colonizer or a settler literature. So to give you an example, the short stories and novels of Rudyard Kipling, set in India, would be an example of settler literature. These are then usually followed by writings by natives who were educated within a system set up by the colonizers. So for example, if we're remaining within a South Asian context, the poems of Rabindranath Tagore, the short stories and novels of Prem Chand, right? People who grew up in the colonizer's educational system. And over time then, an independent literature develops, sometimes marked by a radical break from the past, often marked really more by a kind of hybridity though. If we look at African literature, for example, the novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote his first several novels in English, then rejected English as a medium, and now writes solely in his native language of Kikuyu. Now, outside of Kenya, very few people read or speak Kikuyu. But his novels do still end up getting translated into English. The point being, though, that he is trying to develop a literary tradition that is independent of that of the colonial system in which he was raised and educated. Now, it probably also would help at this point if we define some key critical terms in postcolonial theory. The first being the idea of the center and the periphery, right? The center refers really sort of to the center of power in a postcolonial system, right? In a colonial society. The center could be the colonizer's home country, it could be the capital city of that country, can also refer to the center of the colonizer's power in the colonized nation or the colonized society. The periphery refers to that which is excluded from the center. Right, so lands, for example, that are dominated by a colonial power and have no influence themselves over the direction things are going. Right. The periphery refers to those areas that are excluded from the colonists' power. They are lands inhabited predominantly by people referred to as subalterns. Now, the subaltern, this is a term coined by, or at least in the context we're using it, it's a term coined by the Italian Marxist cultural theorist Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci uses this term to mean populations that are kept outside of the hierarchical power structures of the colony and the colonial homeland, right? So people who are under the authority of the colonizing power, but are excluded from power themselves. The term comes actually from British military lingo. Subaltern is a kind of junior officer who doesn't have a commission. So to illustrate the concept here, this is a German advertisement for safety razors. And the reason why I feel like this is actually a particularly good and telling illustration of subalternity is the way we see the two depicted here. Right? The white European is an adult man, right? Shaving his face, right? Engaged in a manly activity. The African, meanwhile, is represented both as a boy and as a servant, right? A child and a servant aiding and abetting the white man. The other thing that's interesting about this here, though, is that the African servant is holding up a mirror to the white man. This is in some ways a reflection of the idea of alterity. Alterity refers to the condition of always being the other in a binary, right? Always being on the side of the binary, the side of a pair that is construed as non-normative, that is excluded from power, that is excluded from identification. Right? The side of the pair that you don't identify with. Essentialism is a term that comes from anthropology. Essentialist anthropologists tended to view all human cultures as basically the same, right? They were looking for broad patterns of similarity between cultures. So when someone is engaging in essentialism, what they are assuming is that all members of a particular category, often defined rather arbitrarily, are essentially the same, or are more alike than they are different, right? This is a particularly vexing problem in the study of post-colonial literatures. Right? A lot of post-colonial literary studies do tend towards a kind of essentialism, right? They often ignore, say, regional and religious differences between South Asian authors. They will ignore national linguistic and religious differences between African or West Indian authors. They'll sort of lump all of these groups together into a single category and assume that they all represent or are all saying more or less the same thing. That's essentialism. Hegemony. This is another term that comes to us from Antonio Gramsci. Now, what Gramsci means when he talks about hegemony is, on the one hand, in an imperial system, the predominance of one country over others. So what we're going to be looking at, by and large, is literature produced in countries that were subject to British hegemony. Right? Our course covers pretty much exclusively the Anglophone world, the old British Empire. So all of these are countries that would have been under British hegemony. Hegemony also refers to, like, within a particular culture, the cultural dominance of one social class over others. And the values, the social norms, the behaviors of that class are then imitated and distributed throughout the society, right? They become what's considered normal. Those values that are spread through hegemony are referred to as ideology. This is a Marxist term that predates Gramsci. But yeah, ideology refers to the values of the ruling class that are propagated through the media, through society, through social channels that are controlled by the elite in a society. And finally, it's important to understand the distinction between the nation and the nation state. Right? A nation refers to a group of people who meet some set of ethnic criteria, right? Members of, say, the Cherokee Nation or the Kikuyu Nation. A nation state is a state that defines citizenship in large part on these kinds of ethnic lines. And one of the difficulties when we talk about post-colonial cultures, post-colonial nations, is that the national boundaries are often not defined by ethnic identity. They're not defined by sort of pre-existing national boundaries. They're defined by the limits of British power, by the limits of French power, the limits of Belgian power, right? So, Kenya, for example, represents the area of East Africa that the British controlled. Nigeria represents the part of West Africa that the British controlled. It was the colonizing power that drew the boundaries, not the people who actually lived there. And then they have to try to forge a new national identity, dealing with groups that have often been rivals, that don't speak the same home languages, that are often, culturally different, and that sometimes have had, a history of enmity with other local groups. So, one of the problems that's attendant upon post-colonial theory is where the idea of the nation is to be found in the post-colony, in the post-colonial moment. Now, language also becomes a bit of a problem for the post-colonial writer. There's a disjunction now between language and place. The language you were educated in is probably not the language you spoke at home, and is almost certainly not the language your ancestors spoke. Now, this cuts two ways, right? For the settler and the colonist, the home language is now forced to accommodate a completely new geographical reality that bears little or no resemblance to their own sort of inherited literary tradition. For example, there's a short story by Doris Lessing. It's called The Old Chief Mashlanga. And near the beginning of that story, the narrator is a teenage girl who describes sort of her childhood growing up in what is now Zimbabwe, and how the books that she reads describe an English countryside of ash trees and rivers and snow, while her lived reality is savanna, thorn trees, and a dry, scrappy, threadbare little farm. Right, so the inherited literary equipment that she's come to the place with is not up to the task of describing the place where she is now. Now, for the indigenous population, the problem is different. If you want anyone outside of your own small national group to read you, you have to adapt the colonist's language to describe local or traditional conditions. Probably the best description of this particular problem you'll find in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, Decolonizing the Mind. Now, his answer, as I mentioned, to this particular problem is to stop writing in English altogether and to write only in Gikuyu. But for an author writing in a minority language who wants to reach a wider audience, this is often a difficult and troubling kind of choice. Now, the Martinician psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon, right, pictured here, wrote about the post-colonial state in his 1961 book, The Wretch of the Earth. And this, I think, is, well, for me anyway, the most important quote in the book. We cannot go resolutely forward unless we first realize our alienation. We have taken everything from the other side. Yet the other side has given us nothing except to sway us in its direction through 1,000 twists, except lure us, seduce us, and imprison us by 10,000 devices, by 100,000 tricks. To take also means on several levels being taken. It is not enough to try and disengage ourselves by accumulating proclamations and denials. It is not enough to reunite with the people in a past where they no longer exist. We must rather reunite with them in their recent countermove, which will suddenly call everything into question. We must focus on that zone of hidden fluctuation where the people can be found. For let there be no mistake, it is here that their souls are crystallized and their perception and respiration transfigured. Now, this is translated from French, so oftentimes when French is translated into English, it sounds a little bit abstract. Basically, what Fanon is talking about here is the basic fact that post-colonial societies have been shaped by the ideology of the colonizer. There's no getting around that. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't go back to some imagined idyllic past and pretend that you still are just as you were before the colonizer came. Things are different now. And you have to locate the people in that place where they are now, which is a hybrid place. A place between the colonizer culture, whatever their originary culture was, and the melange of cultures that make up the new nation. Post-colonial existence is, by its very nature, regarded by Fanon as hybrid existence, for better or worse. Now, there are two linguistic strategies that post-colonial writers will typically adopt, sort of two different kinds of responses to this problem. The first is abrogation. We're going to see that especially in Sam Sullivan's novel, The Lonely Londoners. A writer who chooses the path of abrogation refuses to conform to the categories of the colonizer culture. So The Lonely Londoners, you'll find, for example, is written entirely in present tense. It doesn't really have a plot. It traces the movements and personal lives, working lives, of a number of West Indian migrants to London. And it does so in a West Indian dialect of English, right? So the standard dialect of the colonizer's language is decentered, but it's left just familiar enough to be comprehensible to a speaker or reader of the standard dialect, right? The language is used to signify the difference of the writer, the narrator, the characters, but in a way that's still comprehensible to readers from the colonizer culture. Now, appropriation, on the other hand, adopts the standard dialect of the colonizer's language. You'll see that, for example, when we read Bharati Mukherjee's novel Jasmine. It's entirely in completely standard English. The colonizer's language in a work of this sort is used typically to describe the burden of peripheral existence, right? You may have adopted the colonizer's language, you may have adopted many of the colonizer's cultural practices and customs, but the irony is that even as you do so, you remain an outsider. And appropriation as a linguistic strategy often really kind of brings this idea to the fore. Now, the concept around this particular class on post-colonialism will be centered is the idea of diaspora. The word diaspora is derived from the Greek diasperin. Dia means over or through, and sperin means to scatter or sow. So diaspora is a scattering over, a scattering through. The first recorded use of the word is in the Septuagint in the 3rd century BCE. Now, the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures that was intended for the use of Hellenized Jews living in Alexandria. And diaspora is a translation in Greek of the Hebrew word za'ava, which means trouble or horror. And it's used to describe a condition of spiritual anguish caused by the breakup and dispersal of the nation and separation from the original homeland. But there is also a hint of promise of future reintegration, right? Eventually, the people who are scattered throughout the world will gather again in the homeland and will be made whole again. The Jews who were forced to migrate from Jerusalem after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, are what we typically describe as the Jewish diaspora. And this is kind of the first diaspora that we really talk about in history. This is an illustration from the Arch of Titus, which depicts Roman soldiers looting the goods of the Second Temple. So diaspora just means migration, right? Absolutely friggin' not. Diaspora must meet a fairly specific, a group of migrants must meet a fairly specific set of criteria in order to be regarded as a diaspora. First, the migration is usually involuntary, right? The Jewish diaspora were forced out by the Romans. The Indian diaspora in the West Indies and Africa, they were brought there as indentured servants at a time when the slavery was outlawed throughout the British Empire. The African diaspora, right, brought over to the West Indies and the United States and South America via the Middle Passage as slaves. Right. The Irish diaspora, not necessarily forced out of Ireland by an army or by politics, but by poverty and starvation in the 1840s. The nation in diaspora also never quite assimilates fully into the host culture. The connection to the homeland is maintained, whether literally or metaphorically. Right, so they don't quite dissolve into British culture or American culture or what have you. This migration also often occurs within a multipolar network, right? They rarely go just to one country, right? There are, for example, in the Jewish diaspora, there are Jews throughout Europe, throughout North America, throughout the Middle East, even in India and in Central Asia. And these networks are often in touch with each other. Right? They maintain contact in part through simply keeping the same traditions. Right? Migrants go to several destinations, and new settlements have to survive long enough for a level of connectivity to develop. Now, diaspora also refers both to the act of migration and to the community living outside of the home country. Right? So the Irish diaspora doesn't just refer to the Irish leaving Ireland after the potato famine of the 1840s. It also refers to, it doesn't just refer to the act of leaving, it refers also to those who left and their descendants who remain in the world outside of Ireland. All right, so those are the basics, the very basic things you need to know before we proceed on postcolonial theory and on what a diaspora is exactly. So we'll start next week with Amrita Pritam's novel Pinjar. Pick it up, start reading it. It's quite brief, it's a fairly easy read. And we'll get to talking about that when I see you next week.